world is vast. Landscapes vary dramatically from country to country. With their The world is vast.
Sim. Tudo bem. Tu estás-me aqui a dizer para partilhar. Desculpa, olá, estou aqui um bocado em stress. Estás-me a dizer para compartilhar o fundo do Present Insights com o moderador, mas nós não fizemos isso. Diz aqui no checklist: moderador com background Present Insights. Então, o vídeo fazes tu, não é? Porque eu não estou a conseguir fazer o vídeo outra vez. Está bem. Ok. Espera aí, deixa-me te pôr-te em alta voz. Como é que esta merda se aqui? Sim.
Fazíamos uma coisa que era, tu dás-me co-host logo na primeira coisa que fazes e eu vou tentando...
Já podes entrar, eu já estou com isto ligado.
Ah, já?
Já.
Pois é, estás em stress então, não é hora?
Epá, estou porque tive aqui um stress de outra coisa que não tinha nada a ver e já estava a ver a vida andar para trás e, epá, pronto. Um gajo não está habituado a fazer eventos. Isto... Eu já estava a dizer, já cá estou, era isso. Estou a ouvir.
Estava a perguntar se me estavas a ouvir no Zoom, mas era no telemóvel. Disseste que sim. Então podemos ir indo.
Staff já está. Me tornar co-anfitrião, já está. O que é que estás a ver neste momento?
Vejo-te a ti e ao slide.
E viste agora a mudar?
Sim. Isso, perfeito.
Aqui o vídeo não está lá.
Então, deixa-me testar já eu. This will stop other screen sharing. Do you want to continue? Continue. E agora está aqui. Share sound. Share.
The world is vast. Landscapes vary dramatically from country to country. Yet there is one common denominator.
Sim.
Prison is everywhere.
Stop sharing. Okay. Depois, more. Vou tirar o raise hands. Attendees. Vamos pondo done nas cenas.
Sim.
Show non-video participants. Ui, que merda. Fuck, fiz aqui uma cena que agora não sei como é que se tira. Hide non-video participants, tá. Isso. Ok. Q&A.
Isso já está.
Já está? Done. O meu cargo, como é que se chama?
Co-host, já está.
Não, o nome do...
Staff.
Já está presente site staff, perfeito. Então está a regir. Done. Done. Tu já és host, eu já sou co-host. Já testaste a apresentação, não é? Done. Eu testei o share vídeo e som, done.
Ah, mas espera lá, que eu agora não estou...
Agora não estás porque eu quando fiz eu o share tirei o teu, percebes? Isso. Perfeito.
Tiraste o som?
Tirei só porque temos aqui
Caga
temos...
nisso.
Oh, Leonor, dá a volta. Dá a volta com a cadeira.
Dá a volta, caralho. Até eu vou pôr os óculos.
Pronto, vamos lá passar um bocadinho.
Mas tu vais estar sem vídeo?
Quer lá para fora?
Ah, bem, mas é para as miúdas ao princípio.
Também vai também.
O intérprete tens que ser tu, eu não consigo. Só o host é que consegue.
Sim.
Fazer spotlight, precisamos deles os dois.
O spotlight é...
Imagina que eu estou com câmara, não estou? Estás-me a ver?
Estás.
Pronto, se fores ao...
Sim. Explicar para todas as pessoas, é isso, não é?
Exato, the host has spotlighted your video forever. Agora tens de tirar. Isso.
É pinar isto.
É pôr elas as duas, que assim garantes que eles ficam lado a lado.
Vá, nunca mais chegam, pá. Vamos chamar o cigarrinho?
Bora. Vou só enrolar, espera aí.
Vai, não quer mexer. Vai falando, eu estou a ouvir, mas eu não quero mexer no computador.
Pois, eu também não queria. Então vou-te ligar para o telemóvel, mas é...
Isto agora é só assign them Essa ainda, depois a história do inquérito, o background já está. Temos alguém como ninguém sabe. Sim, mas não conseguimos ver antes. Mas é chata a história de Sandro porque não dá a falar de cortar no sol. Praticamente isso. Está bem, mas pode acontecer. Há sempre a outra pessoa continuar a falar e não vai a palavra. Então aparece a voz em inglês. Já dá para pagar o Zoom. Mas então devia ter uma sozinha lá no auditório. Mas... Então, onde é que eu tenho os atendidos? Pois aqui isto em tela cheia está sempre a aparecer e a desaparecer. Eu queria que isto ficasse cá. Bom. Não, mas é por causa do share. Não, aqui no Windows. Não. Não, agora não vamos mostrar. Doca para baixo. Pois, mas a doca, não, eu queria que a doca ficasse fixa. Sim. Docs. Interromper gravação, interpretação, levantar a mão, ao vivo em Facebook, desativar a anotação dos participantes. Anotação. Quer dizer, editar a anotação dos participantes. O que é isso? Sim. Sim. Diz. Está tudo bem? Diz lá. Parou, mas se calhar não tem folhas. Já viste se tem folhas?
Não sei já agora.
Isabel?
Olá,
Alô, tudo bem?
tudo. Eu não estou a falar com o Duarte?
Com o Duarte, sim, desculpa.
Ok.
Sem câmara. Vou ligar aqui a minha câmara, a ver se te aparece.
Tranquilo.
Como estás?
Olá, Isabel.
Olá, tudo bem?
É o Pedro.
Olá, Pedro. Está tudo bem, eu estou só aqui um bocado preocupada, porque eu acho que eu não vou conseguir traduzir isto. Estava a ver os vídeos
Da base.
da base a falar, não vai ser fácil. Mas vou dar o meu melhor, mas não vai ser
É
nada.
isso, é isso. Cada um der o seu melhor, está ganho.
Só espero que não esteja muita gente no canal português.
Não conheces a Direção-Geral de Reinserção e Serviços Prisionais, ninguém fala inglês.
Pois, oh meu Deus.
Não, mas tranquilo. Mas
Ok.
o que é que tu sentes dificuldade?
Bom, eu achava que, ok, eu sei falar fluentemente inglês e português tudo bem, mas eu estou a ver aqui que é preciso um grande treino de coordenação entre ouvir e falar. E eu acho que isso é uma coisa que eu não tenho, assumidamente.
Vai correr bem.
Portanto, o que eu pensei, ok, vou ouvir um bocado mais tempo, vou passar os principais pontos e.
Sim, normalmente a tradução simultânea tem sempre este delay, ou seja, a pessoa não é automático, né? Tu estás a ouvir e começas a falar.
Uhum.
Onde é que está?
Temos aqui a Inês Viterbo que entrou. Está sem microfone.
Não sei, não consigo ver.
Oh, Duarte, eu não estou a encontrar
Sim.
aqui o intérprete.
Tu não estás a encontrar o intérprete?
Não.
Tem que estar em baixo no interpretation.
Q&A, enquetes, transmitir, novo compartilhamento.
Manda-me um print screen, se faz favor. Vou entrar na conta do eventos.
Não, agora não.
Vou só para ver, mas tenho quase certeza que isso foi posto no... Já não me deixa editar. Deixa-me só ver aqui. Enable Language Interpretation, portanto, ele está ativo. Mandaste-me print screen?
Mandei.
Hi, Vaz. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. We're just checking up the technicalities.
Okay,
Very welcome with us.
good to sort of see you.
Yeah. Oh, I can turn the camera on.
Okay, hi.
Yeah.
Hey Buzz, how are you?
I'm good. Good to see you guys.
Okay.
We're just checking up how the translation channel might work, Baz. That's why.
Of course. Yeah, no problem. I'm here.
Guys, is my background okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice.
Perfect. Okay, so let me put this here. So I hope there are no ambulances here in the next hour because I live close to a hospital and there are a bunch of ambulances going on all the time.
Well, it creates a sense of urgency, you know.
Totally.
That's very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What time is now in New York, Buzz?
It is 10 minutes to 2. So, and there's
Okay.
and I live in Manhattan, so there's ambulances and police sirens and all that. So I think we'll have beautiful ambiance.
How many registrations did we get, guys, at the end?
Yeah, I was about to say that more than 270 people enrolled, Baz. So and people from very different backgrounds, from like collaborators of our prison administration, from prison directors to technicians. And we also have people from the academia, lawyers. We have a judge also with us, deputies of our parliament as well. So students from different backgrounds, law, psychology. Yeah, you will find different profiles in our audience.
That's great.
Yeah, we're enthusiastic about the number of subscriptions and also the profile of those who are joining us.
Fantastic. And how are things looking in Portugal with lockdowns and so on?
So we finally got out of the emergency state, so things are looking better now. But yeah, but let's see how it works. The vaccination process is also speeding up, so we're hoping not to get another lockdown in the future. But yeah, it looks good.
Nice. That's good to
There,
hear. Yeah.
how are things there, Baz?
Really good. They just announced they're fully reopening New York City 100% July 1st.
Nice.
Yeah. So, but things have been feeling quite positive here for at least the last month or so. I mean, at this point, I think in the US, it's really just going to be a matter of people. I mean, the vaccine access is there. We just have too many crazy people who don't want to take it. So it's a bit scary.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be really split, like 50-50.
And how is the access to prison establishments? Can families visit?
They're slowly starting to reopen. It's still closed right now, but that is starting to change. And from my understanding, a lot of programs are being let back in the fall to start up again. I mean, particularly the university programs, and other kinds of education programs. But I think they're going to start letting if the city is reopening July 1st, then I imagine that would be a date for families to be permitted inside as well.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. Is there talk there about vaccinating the incarcerated population?
From what we knew from the Director General of our prison establishments, the discussion was whether the people incarcerated would be treated under the same criteria as everybody else outside prisons, meaning giving priority to the eldest, to the ones that had some kind of disease, or if they would be treated as a priority group in and of themselves, just because they do not represent a huge group in our society, so they could be they could fastly vaccinate all the incarcerated people, but they were not given a priority as a group, so they would follow the same criteria as everyone else outside. So
that means that they are somehow being vaccinated right now, right?
Yeah.
Those under the priority groups.
Yeah.
Interesting.
How was it done there, Bas? Were they vaccinated with priority?
It depends. It varies from state to state quite a bit. So in some states, yes, they were prioritized. In others, not. But at this point, I mean, like there's a lot of vaccine available, and it's been mobilized. I mean, the US knows how to do corporate rollouts. So when it comes to machines like Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, the corporations have things under control. But the government is another story, but hey. So I think that, yeah, I mean, it's just quite amazing on so many levels, because for so many people, like the idea of, yeah, of course I should be able to just walk in and get a free vaccine, but that should apply to all of our healthcare in this country, which it doesn't. You can't just go in and see a doctor here. It's like, without paying for it. So it's just a lot of things have become evident that when push comes to shove, a lot of those things that we think we can't do, we can actually do.
Yeah. But there are a lot of people that still don't want to get the vaccine.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not, as what you'd imagine, it's not New York City so much. I mean, it's sort of kind of, it's interesting because it's different segments of the population. I mean, there is still a piece of kind of the Black and brown community that doesn't want to, because of distrust, you know, valid distrust, given the history of the way the US has experimented on peoples of color in this country and all kinds of other horror shows. So that runs deep, but I think that's actually a lot less of an issue because, I mean, you know, lots of African Americans, Latinos are indeed getting vaccinated. The more intense issue is the COVID deniers and the mask, you know, protesters. They're the ones who just don't want to do it. And evangelical groups, like things like that, kind of, you know, the Trumpites, basically.
Yeah.
So in New York, I mean, we're at more than 30, I think 35% full vaccinated already. And I'm sure it'll be much higher than that. But in other parts of the country, I don't know.
Yeah.
So to me, it just feels like the ultimate slap in the face, you know, of American privilege too, because
yeah,
you know, like,
that's what I was going to say. Like
it is. It's that's
Black vaccine. So if you don't want them, send them to us.
I know. I mean, like I talk to obviously I'm talking to colleagues and comrades all over the world on a regular basis, and you know, I'm embarrassed to say that I got it. I'm not a high risk group. I'm 44 years old, like, and it was easily available to me, and it's just ridiculous. It disgusts me. I mean, what's going on in India now? I think about it so much every day. It's just like a horror show. And if we wanted to, we could get it together to vaccinate the world, like easily. It shouldn't be this. It's patents. It's capitalism. But anyway, I'll stop ranting and raving and save that for our conversation.
Okay, very good. Do we have already someone on the waiting room?
Zoom, hi Baz. Zoom webinar don't have waiting room. So as soon as
so we open and they will enter.
And they are free to enter, yeah. So, but I know some people are already waiting. So they already clicked join and they are just, you know, that
you're watching the clicks.
Yeah. But yeah. So
okay, so all
5
good?
minutes, all good, 5 minutes. We only have one extra step to do. I will not speak, so my baby will not be listening during the webinar. So it's only to put Isabel as a translator, and then we will deactivate all cameras and microphones, exception made to Baz and Lenia. And yeah, but let's wait another 2 minutes. We do these steps and
it's just a reminder, but once we accept the entrance of the attendees to the webinar, there is a delay of 10 seconds before you Lenia, can start speaking, because they won't hear you meanwhile. But apart from that, I think that's all. Yeah.
Okay, and then Baz, we will just wait for about 3 minutes, and then we will start at 7:03 sharp.
Okay.
It's just to grant that everyone gets a regular access to the conference past the waiting.
Yeah, I'm gonna mute for now. And should I stop my video as well or keep it on?
No, keep it on.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Unless you want it because you want privacy, but but it's fine. If you
No, I'm good. We've all done away with privacy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Duarte, hi everyone. Duarte, can I ask you a question? Quick one.
Yes.
So I'll have a button that I click OK, and then I'll be speaking to the channel of interpretation, right? Translation.
Exactly. Yeah. As soon as you click OK, we don't listen you anymore in the main channel, and once you speak, you are speaking to the secondary channel.
Okay, great.
So you listen everyone as you are in the main channel, but when you speak, your sound goes to another one.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think we can do it now. If you need something, we are in the WhatsApp group. Fine?
Okay, cool.
Thank you, Isabel, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, English to Portuguese. So Isabel probably will see now the pop-up.
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. So, yeah, I will also mute my microphone, and Pedro Caio will let you know when.
Foi um bocadinho cedo demais. A little bit too early, sorry.
So Pedro Caio will let you know when we start webinar. Good luck. Thank you.
2 minutes to go. 2 minutes to go to the 3 minutes. Olá, Lénia. Hello, Baz. It's Felipe.
Hey, Pedro.
Yeah.
Guys, can you just move to the next slide so that I see what's there?
So we'll start with this one. And when I change to the other one, you can start speaking. That will be 10 seconds, okay?
Okay, perfect.
And then we'll have the ending one. And Duarte also will put a video during the talk. Okay?
Thank you.
So, yeah, within 1 minute, I'll start the webinar and I'll mute myself. Okay, I'll start now. I'll mute myself. Have a nice talk. Cheers.
So welcome everyone. We will be starting at 7:03 sharp. I wanted to remind you that throughout the conversation, you can feel free to use the Q&A box to add your questions. And we will also have simultaneous translation available. So you just have to click on the Zoom bottom bar on the interpretation channel. Thank you. So welcome again, everyone. We will be starting this session at 7:03 sharp. At any moment, you can leave your questions on a Q&A box. We will have some time at the end of this conversation to answer to them. And you can also choose to listen to this conversation in Portuguese. So you just have to use the buttons that you have on the bottom bar in Zoom. Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Prison Insights 21, an event that is co-organized by APAC Portugal and Instituto Miguel Galvão Teles. So my name is Lenia Mestrinho. I'm a board member of APAC Portugal, and I will be hosting today's conversation with Baz Dreisinger. So welcome, Baz.
Thank you for having me.
So let me start by briefly introduce you to Baz. And here I will be quoting from her latest book. So Baz is an English professor specializing in African American cultural studies, a Caribbean carnival lover who is also a prison educator and criminal justice activist, a freelance producer for National Public Radio, so the well-known NPR, a reggae fanatic, and an agnostic New York Jew. So Baz has worked as a journalist, a music critic, an academic, and produced 2 documentaries about hip hop and the justice system. And Baz was also named a 2017-18 Global Fulbright Scholar. So welcome again, Baz, and we are really pleased to have you here.
It's great to be in conversation with you. Thank you for having me.
So as you put it before, Baz, this is quite a blend of identities. So I will come back to some of these topics later, but now I would like to start with your core activity. So you are a tenured professor of English at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is part of the City University of New York. And in 2010, you've created this program called Prison to College Pipeline. Can you explain us a little bit how this program works?
Sure, and thank you for reminding me that I'm an English professor, because sometimes I forget and most people have no idea, considering they assume I'm a lawyer or a criminologist or sociologist. And I often say that, in fact, my coming from a lot of different worlds and also my coming from outside the world of criminal justice, as an academic, actually helps me because it allows me to see things from a different perspective and not take things for granted, which is, fuels what I do. So the Prison to College Pipeline is a program that I launched at John Jay College about 11 years ago. And it stems from the idea of giving people who have been historically denied access to education a first chance at education. And I'm very careful to say first chance, because we often talk about people in prison being given second chances and so on at education, at opportunities, etc. But in fact, given historical inequality, given historical racism and inequity and systemic racism and inequity, most people in prisons worldwide, as I've seen over the many years, have not been given first chances. So the idea was to offer university level education in prison, but also create an avenue for education to be the centerpiece of people's reintegration into society when they come home from prison. And so in a nutshell, what the program was designed to do was offer the start of university classes on the inside. So our students would work toward college credits or university level credits while they're incarcerated. And then when they come home, they're guaranteed a place in university. And then we have a team that would work with them on all of the great challenges of reintegration, from housing to trauma-informed care to job assistance, et cetera. So it's a bit of the idea being the best of both worlds, that you're able to benefit from education on the inside, but also benefit from all of the things that universities have to offer on the outside, which is network building, which is community, which is access to various kinds of resources. And the program, as I said, we launched 11 years ago, or I started planning it 11 years ago. And since then it's grown, it's evolved. I'm still very involved. I'm not the academic director anymore, because I'm not in the country. Prior to COVID, I was not in the US enough, but we have also launched versions of the Prison to College Pipeline and continue to collaborate internationally with other university programs on the inside. But we did launch in South Africa, in Cape Town, South Africa in 2018, and continue to grow there. And it's a big part of the work that I do is around access to education, and also around the pipeline model, the idea that the work work that we do, broadly speaking, in prisons must also continue on the outside, that it's not enough to do the work inside without, putting an emphasis on the work on the outside.
And you are also bringing your John Jay students to have at least some of the classes together with your incarcerated students, right? So what do you feel is the impact that this have on both of them?
Yeah, it's tremendous. I mean, we have something called the learning exchange, and it's called that very specifically because learning exchange implies equality, that they're both learning from each other. So it's not that the students from the campus, from the outside, go into the prison and tutor or teach. They're considered equals. They're fellow students, and so they go in once a month and learn alongside their incarcerated peers in a variety of subjects. We also bring in a variety of professors to teach kind of one-off courses in these learning exchanges. And for the incarcerated students, it's an opportunity to be in as normal a setting as is possible given a prison. And that's hugely transformative for them, not only intellectually, but emotionally and psychologically, to be able to feel that sense of normalcy, of humanity, really. And for our students who come in on the outside, and I should say that the City University of New York is enormously diverse campuses. We have students from all over the world, all neighborhoods of New York City. They are not, privileged, coming from only wealthy white backgrounds. They're, coming from across the board. So many of them may have family members incarcerated and so on, but still they have misperceptions and stereotypes about people in prison and their capabilities and so on. And so when they go inside and come to know these people in this intellectual setting, it transforms their whole perception of the justice system. And that also really deeply shapes what I do, broadly speaking, which is we cannot change policy without changing culture, without changing the minds and the ideas of the people in society who are completely wrong about what builds safety, and also have radical misconceptions about incarceration and the people who are incarcerated.
What is the percentage of students, Baz, that have in fact enrolled in university after they are being released?
So we would the latest numbers would be somewhere around 35%. And among those, we've already had plenty of graduates. We have a student on full scholarship in law school right now. Another is a George Soros Justice Fellow. And so, I mean, I could go on all day about their many accomplishments. But I think one thing that I point out is that it's not only about getting degrees. And that isn't our only measure of success. I'm in touch with about 98% of the students who've gone through this program still. And, I would say that of those 98%, 97% of them are living rich, fulfilling, successful lives. They've built families. They're writing poetry. They're participating in community work. Giving back in various ways. And so I think we have to measure success, for one, not only in terms of recidivism rates. I mean, that's setting the bar quite low. I want more for people to come out of prison and to just not go back to prison. They should come out and have the opportunities and live the thriving lives that they should have been able to do in the first place. So I think we have to think about how to measure this. And I think it's been an overwhelming success. And what it does for people is bigger than education. It's about knowing how to communicate in the world differently, relate to one's neighbors and fellow citizens differently, think differently about community. Being a university student at one point in your life, especially while incarcerated, changes you in really dramatic ways that have nothing to do with the degree. So I think that's so important.
Can you tell us, Baz, at least one success story of a student of yours that or for whom the prison to college pipeline was really life-changing?
Well, I'll tell you about my student Melvin, who I just mentioned is in law school now. We met when he was in the very first cohort of the program. So we met some 11 years ago. He was in his early 20s. He was in there, without getting into the details of his case, he took a plea bargain while he was on Rikers Island as a very young man, while Rikers Island was one of the most, remains one of the most dangerous places in the world. But at that time, particularly so, it's a gang-ridden environment, and young people are often just taking plea bargains out of desperation to get out of there, not because they're necessarily guilty and end up with long prison sentences. It's a crisis in many places, but particularly in the US and in New York. And so he landed in prison. He started the program. He was struggling. He eventually kind of got it together. When he came home, though, he hesitated to continue school. He really wanted to pursue law because he wanted to be a defense lawyer and be the kind of lawyer that he didn't have. But he was told, you might not be able to get a job. You may not be admitted to the bar to be permitted to practice as a lawyer if you have a prison history. And we supported him and persuaded him otherwise, that there was enough of a precedent and he should pursue this. He had many obstacles along the way. The parole system in the US, whereby people can be sent back to prison at the drop of the hat if they're on parole for minor technical violations, really did him in and landed him in Rikers Island again for over a month. He almost lost everything. He came home, he graduated. He took the admittance exams for law school, must have been about 4 or 5 times until he got the score that he needed. And now, not only did he get into Seton Hall Law School, but he's there on a full scholarship, which in a US context is extremely rare to get that kind of support, and is now building out other kinds of progressive ideas around how to develop defense and how to develop access to fair justice for those who are incarcerated. So it's a pretty, I think that what's so great about that story is it speaks to the way that a program like this can impact larger systems and structures. That one person who benefits from this can then go on to impact change in a very big way.
Yeah, and it's really important that you provide them this network of support throughout the way, because going out, it's not easy either. And Bas, how did you get involved at all with the prison system?
Well, it's a bit of a story, and I know you read my book, so I get into it there. But it was not alien to me growing up. I am a New York City native. I grew up in the Bronx, and I grew up at that moment, although it was unbeknownst to me, when mass incarceration in the United States was really ramping up to the horrifying degree that it exists in the current day. And the 80s is the years when the prisons were being built. But I ultimately first went into a prison when I was invited to do so. I was doing a lot of writing as a journalist about race and crime and culture and the arts, and especially hip hop and reggae music, Caribbean music, and started getting a lot of letters from people in prison. And one thing led to another, and I found myself just going inside as an educational volunteer, invited by an organization. It was an educational organization that I'm still in touch with to this day. So this was almost 20 years ago. And I just kept going and kept going. And the truth is, I think you can know something intellectually. You can know that, the prisons don't make sense, or that prisons don't work. But until you're faced with it day in, day out, going inside and every day really seeing that, it doesn't sink in, I think, in a visceral way. And that was when it really sunk in a visceral way for me. And I also started to become quite close to a number of people, whether it was friends who were incarcerated or people that I was coming to know through my various visits. And it just, it kind of weaved its way into my, my heart and my mind. It was not just an intellectual endeavor, and it never is.
So you are also, Bas, the executive director of Incarceration Nations Network, which I will call by INN from now on. And INN is a global network and a think tank of people that supports innovative prison reforms all over the world and advocates for some very specific core issues, some of them also based on the UN Nelson Mandela rules. So I would like you to explain us some of them. And the first one that I picked was this one, and I will be quoting here, that says that solitary is madness. So this is a form of confinement that is also foreseen under the Portuguese legislation. So can you share with us what is the idea behind this statement?
Yeah, well, solitary is madness is sort of the perfect statement because it's it's a double entendre. It means in the literal sense, solitary confinement produces madness, that we know that what happens when you lock someone up alone for really any amount of time. And I think the world after COVID recognizes this even more so than ever, although, our experience of quote lockdown cannot possibly be compared to a prison, being incarcerated. But I think we have a sense of what confinement does to a person. And solitary is extreme confinement. It still exists all over the world, and to varying degrees and at varying lengths of it being permitted. And it is torture. And it really is nothing short of that. And so, as an organization, I mean, we really are a cheerleader for our partners and an amplifier for our partners. So we support what they support. And there's none of our partners who would not agree that solitary is madness, both in that it produces mental illness, that is sometimes irrevocable. Many studies have been done. I cite some of these in my book. And also that it's madness in that it's not going to create safer communities. Something that I'm always pointing out, right? If we drive people to madness by putting them in a little cell by themselves for, months, days, years, whatever it is, they're going to come back further damaged and then cause further damage in society. It's not rocket science. It's really quite basic. And in my book and also in my travels, I've spent time, visiting solitaries. I actually spent time in a supermax in Brazil, modeled after the US style supermax, where you see people in levels of solitary confinement that are doing irrevocable damage to their mental health and therefore irrevocable damage to us. So solitary is a basic absolute no.
So another issue that you advocate for, and again, I will be quoting here, is who is the target? So implying that from prison statistics all over the world, certain groups and certain communities might be overrepresented in the prison population. And this also leads us to the main topic of our session, which is, are prisons really like global repositories for the underprivileged? So can you elaborate a little bit on this as well?
Yeah, it's funny, when I was posting the the title of the talk, I wrote in the caption, I said, by the way, this title is a rhetorical question, because the answer is, of course. I mean, what I have seen all over the world is that the system tends to operate almost identically. It targets and identifies an other, and that other could be by race, by class, by gender. And then it deliberately criminalizes that other by tilting the system against them one way or another, creating laws that are inevitably going to be broken by this particular group. And then it mass incarcerates them. And it does this, and I can talk specific examples in a moment, but generally speaking and globally speaking, it does this in order to maintain social control, and often racial control, class control, and also often to maintain a labor force. We have to recognize, and this is a whole other issue, which I'm sure we'll get into, but the prison industrial complex is a summary of how capitalism has been long intertwined with our, quote unquote, justice systems. And so in the United States, where, we talk very openly now, it wasn't always the case. But in recent years, especially as there have been some powerful films and books on this issue, it's a known fact that slavery is a direct descendant of, that mass incarceration is a direct descendant of slavery. So that you had a scenario where African Americans who were initially contained and controlled for a capitalism labor force were enslaved once they became free. There were laws created that criminalized Blackness in all kinds of ways. So loitering, joblessness, things that are now known as misdemeanors, which are still criminalizing Black and brown folks in the US. And then they could be incarcerated, and hence the birth of mass incarceration. And, you know, overall, as I've traveled the world and engaged with communities and organizations all over the world, what you see is the same pattern playing out. So whether it's Aboriginal people in Australia, poor people throughout the global South, you know, Eastern Europeans in some parts of Europe, or Roma people who are massively over incarcerated in places like Hungary or the Czech Republic, you're seeing this same pattern in prisons being used in order to dominate over others, while also conveniently, you know, putting them to work or putting them in service. And it also becomes, in some ways, it can also operate in the opposite way, whereas, you know, when somebody doesn't fit into a particular group, poor people who don't fit into the labor force, and you need to just warehouse them away somewhere in a way that makes money for the state, then prisons work in that way as well. So it's still part of, you know, the engine that keeps capitalism going, and that keeps, you know, forms of systemic racism and classism at play.
So at INN, Baz, you basically work together with civil society organizations, activists, and other partners all over the world to advocate for these topics that we just spoke about, but also some other core issues on education, health, and so on. So what do you feel has been INN's biggest achievement so far?
Well, I think the very existence of a network, a global network, which was years in the making, and getting us all on the same page, literally and metaphorically, and also literally. I mean, we built a platform showcasing our partners, a database that whereby, and it's on our website, incarcerationnationsnetwork.com. If you click on the platform, you can now, you know, search for organizations doing this work all over the world and take a look at our partners in various arenas. That itself was a pretty massive undertaking, considering there was no such thing, you know, prior to this. And it's so important to work on this across borders for so many reasons. But one of them is that we gain much greater support, public support, financial support, potentially, government support, when organizations are doing this in a united fashion and in coalition with other major organizations around the world. And this is particularly true in places of the world, and this is most of the world, where prison and issues of prison reform are massively unpopular. And no one wants to talk about them or fund them, or and I feel like to a great extent that's where INN comes from for me, in that I was part of the movement in the US when it was vastly unpopular and vastly difficult to sell to a funder and to civil society, really. No one wanted to look in the prisons. And that really started to shift to the point where we still have an unbelievable amount of work to do in the US, with 2.3 million people locked up and so on. But it is a far more, I mean, Google was not funding prison reform years ago. Facebook was not interested. And now we see that. That isn't the case in almost everywhere else in the world. And so as we band together, we're a much more powerful force as a movement. And also we're able to really learn from each other and see what works and what smart, innovative justice looks like. I talk a lot about radical imagination in my writing and in the work of INN. And radical imagination means, really having to think about this outside the box and not taking for granted. And that also means looking around us and learning from strong practices where we don't have to reinvent the wheel, where we can, take from others and collaborate with others and in really powerful ways. So it's an exciting thing to be a connective tissue in that way for so many organizations doing incredible work.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So let's move to your travel. So you did something that I think was absolutely, I mean, I would absolutely love to do something like that, which was to travel around the world, volunteering and visiting different prisons in 9 countries for about 2 years. So you describe this experience very well in your latest book, which is called Incarceration Nations: A Journey to Justice in Prisons Around the World. And one of the chapters that, in fact, I've enjoyed the most was the one about Rwanda. So can you tell us a little bit, why did you visit Rwanda in the first place? And also, what did you observe there?
So I wanted, with the book, in many ways, I call the book a work of philosophy, because what I wanted to do with it was upend all of the things that we take for granted about justice and about prisons. Why did these things even exist? And what are we doing when we warehouse human beings as a response to crime and harm in society? And for me, even at that point in the journey, I knew that the book had to start in Rwanda, because I come to this work from a restorative justice framework always, which means that I look first at I center the person who has been harmed in the process. When I think about justice, I think not about, who did it and how to punish them, but rather who experienced the harm and how do we go about repairing that harm as much as possible. And starting from that paradigm, I wanted to go to a country where, a great national harm sat and sits at its core, and engage with survivors of, one of the greatest harms imaginable, namely genocide. And so I worked with an organization. I stayed for some months in Rwanda, volunteering with an organization called Never Again Rwanda. And it was young genocide survivors. And young, I mean, university age. So they were between 18 and 25 or so, who were old enough to have been orphaned, impacted by the genocide, but young enough such that their processing of it might be different from that of their parents. And these particular students wanted to visit prisons where at that time, upwards of 80% of the population was in prison for the crime of genocide. So and they wanted to do this, and that was how I entered the picture. And so I worked with them to develop a program that existed in Rwanda for some time called the Prison Visiting Project. And really what I want to do is just listen to these survivors. And it's something, it's a constant learning process. I must say that in my work, that is something I consistently do, is be quiet and listen to survivors and hear of what their needs are and what their, what their wants are, what brings them healing, what is justice to them. It's a question I always ask someone who talks to me about experiencing harm. What would justice mean for you? I don't assume that it means prisons. And in fact, what I came to see in Rwanda, and of course have come to see even more so the more I do the work, is that what is justice is not prison, that revenge and harm, which is what prison is. I see prison as revenge on a grand scale, and state-sanctioned revenge. It is not going to bring people the satisfaction and the healing that they deserve. And that became really the basis of the book. And from Rwanda, I went to South Africa, another country where, a great national horror sits at its core, apartheid and its legacies, and continued to think about that question. But it was so important to start any journey by being grounded in not the quote offender, but rather the person who has experienced the harm. And it is also, it's one of many enormous misconceptions about the justice system. I think that, I find a lot of the work that I've had to do over the years is kind of myth busting and exploding people's assumptions. And people just assume, oh yeah, of course, everyone who has experienced harm wants the person to go to prison and be harmed. But there are so many studies, whether from the US, California, or from New Zealand, who have done extensive work on this and found that's not the case. And we really need to think beyond our assumptions when it comes to justice.
Yeah, I think there were like 2 ideas that really resonated with me in this chapter. One was that reconciliation rather than punishment might be, you know, the alternative. But another one that I think it's really important for us to bear in mind was that offenders are also victims. And I think this is really, really important to understand the context that we are in. So in a different topic, Baz, and as we could see from your bio at the beginning, you are an arts lover, music lover, reggae and hip hop specifically. And I think you had a chance also, at least in Jamaica and Uganda, two other countries that you visited, to also see some arts-related programs. So what sort of programs did you see, and what sort of rehabilitation power do the arts really possess? And I'm using this word rehabilitation because I know you don't like it. So you can also explain us why.
Yes, the reason I bristle at the term rehabilitation is because rehabilitation implies that people in prison have been habilitated in the first place, when in fact, and this goes back to my comment about second chances and first chances, most people, you know, in these global repositories of the underprivileged have not been habilitated in the first place. So, you know, it's a misnomer of a term. It's also rather condescending, implying that I have the power to come in and rehabilitate you. You know, when in fact your skill, your genius hasn't been given opportunity to thrive. And it implies that, you know, it's the people in prison who need to rehabilitate and not the society that produced them. The inequities, the racisms, the classisms, the sexisms that produce prison cells, and that those need to be rehabilitated. But in terms of arts programs, yeah, I taught English in prison, in the prison to college pipeline, for a decade. I am, you know, a great believer in the power of the arts to heal, to give people agency, to be able to take control of their own narratives in ways that are enormously powerful. I continue to see this happen. It's central to my work. It's central to work of many of our partners, INN partners, who do arts-based rehabilitation programs in the prisons. And in Jamaica, I saw a reggae program in the prison there. In Uganda, I helped start a creative writing program in a dire prison that is drastically overcrowded. It was built for 600 and it has more than, probably even higher than that now, but then it was about 6,000 men, women, children, and people on death row. Ultimately, I'm a tremendous fan of these things, but I call them, in my book, I call them Band-Aids on an amputated limb. Because they're not going to change the system. And in some ways, they prop the system up, because as long as a prison can point to, you know, a nice program, whether it's an education program, a theater program, a music program, then it'll just sort of keep itself going on that, as opposed to really, you know, tackling the systemic issues that are funneling people into the prison system in the first place. And, you know, then of course, keeping them going back once they come out because of the enormous challenges of reintegration. And so it's, you know, it's something that I think is a necessary in the here and now. I mean, you need to, if you're bleeding, you need a Band-Aid, but it's not the solution. That we have to always think more systemically and, you know, big picture all at once. I certainly don't argue that one precludes the other at all.
Okay, but let's travel quickly to Australia. So Australia is one of the countries with the highest percentage of incarcerated people in private prisons. And this is a very, you know, hot and complex topic. We don't have private prisons here in Portugal. We do have them in some European countries. You have them on the US. But I think we tend to always look at the dark side of private prisons. And my question to you is that, did you see anything different? Is there a bright side of private prisons?
It's interesting. I just was having this heated conversation with a former prison warden here in the US who was quite well known and who now works for a private prison company. And I was sort of talking to her about the difference here. Look, I am the first, to me, I don't like prisons, whether they're private, whether they're public. I don't like them, and I don't think they work. And the evidence shows that they don't work as they exist now. And so they're problematic. But what we need to recognize is that the private prison industry, the premise of it, the idea of making money off incarceration, of making money off warehousing of people, is inherently problematic. It is a marriage of capitalism and justice. When in many of these contracts, you're requiring that a certain number of beds be filled, that is an abomination. That means that laws will come forth in order to make sure those beds are filled, or policing methods will ensure. But the thing that I point out is that capitalism and justice are enmeshed, whether in the state system or in the private system. In the US, where we have private prisons, we don't have an overwhelming number of them. But when you look at the state system of prisons, the phone companies, the healthcare, the banking cards that are used, the tablets that are given out for educational purposes, all of that is a money-making entity. All of that is capitalism. And the emails that are sent, I'm on an email program so that I can email some incarcerated people in the US. I have to pay every time I send an email. They have to pay. There are companies making millions and millions of dollars all over the world on incarceration, whether in a private prison or in a public one. And likewise, there are private prisons that, because they are not bound by the bureaucracy of the state, are able to do some more creative things and hire different kinds of staff and do things that are better. But fundamentally, the problem is this marriage of capitalism and justice, and the way that money making exists all over the place. And I think people forget that quite a bit. And one other thing, just on that note, it's important to recognize that one of the greatest trends that we're seeing all over is ankle bracelet monitoring devices. That's a big cash cow in corrections right now. The money that's being made off of those are made by private corporations. And so other things that involve what we're calling e-incarceration, electronic incarceration, surveillance, and so on, that's all money making. And, this is a deeply problematic thing if you believe in justice. Very, very deeply problematic.
So one last question here about your, I think, the last country that you visit, which was Norway. And we know that the Scandinavian countries have a very different philosophy in terms of prison. So I was just surprised by one of the programs that you described at Halden prison. I think it's this IKEA style prison, super high tech, but you were quite blown away with some kind of training that they were given to the officers. So can you very briefly explain this program to us?
Yes, and actually, I think this is often forgotten. Many people talk about the open prisons of Scandinavia and Germany, but they don't talk about the staff and the staff training academy. I had the opportunity to visit the staff training academy in Norway, and I was blown away by it, because it is so radically different from what I've seen anywhere else in the world. And that is because, number one, it's a highly desirable job that pays well and is respected in society. So it's a competitive application process to be accepted as a prison officer. It's something like a teacher, an educator, and it's seen as such. And the curriculum is not just 6 months of military training. It is psychology and law and social work, and it's really quite amazing. And that is so critical, because that's another thing that we have to think about as we keep implementing, one rehabilitation program after another. Until just as a classroom is only as good as its teacher, a prison is only as functional as its officers, as its staff. And if the staff do not care if they're, they are part of this system as well. And so until we actually get people in there, and the same is true about policing and the training of police in countries around the world, again, two hugely important jobs, prison officer and police officer, that the training, if we even know what that training entails, because in many countries, including the US, it's so opaque. What happens in the police academy is what people are actually studying that are doing these incredibly important jobs that are, frankly, capable of taking lives all over the world and destroying lives all over the world. And yet there's so little attention paid to that. And so I think that that's a tremendously important thing. And it's something that pervades the culture of corrections in Norway. And I think that in combination with this idea of an open prison, of being able to leave and go back, of remaining integrated in the community, that's what really starts to move us away towards a culture of care and away from the culture of punitivity that is not going to create the safe and peaceful communities that we desire.
Yeah, I also love this. So you shared in your book some conversations you had with the officers, and this idea that if you treat people like dirt, they will be just dirt. If you treat people like humans, they will just behave as humans. So to finish up this part, Buzz, let us give people here a sneak peek, a 1-minute sneak peek of a series of, a docu-series of 10 episodes that, in fact, you did based on these countries and other countries of INN. So I will ask the team to show us the video quickly.
The world is vast. Landscapes vary dramatically from country to country, yet there is one common denominator. Prison is everywhere. How did this happen? When did this happen? But there have always been prisons, you say. Not so. It all adds up to a cut and paste system of justice. The crisis of prison looks almost identical in its racist horrors from one end of the world to another. But this means that solutions to this evil problem cut across national boundaries too.
Where can we watch the entire series, Buzz?
So yes, I actually just got the news that we'll be premiering the series at the Tribeca Film Festival here in New York in June, which is a tremendous honor. And we're going to be doing some activations around that and rolling out the series in screening events all around the US and the world. So on our website, you can check back, again, incarcerationnationsnetwork.com. The series name is Incarceration Nations, a global docuseries. And we are eager to, if folks are interested, we are doing collaborative screening events, whether virtually or in safe environments in person, and happy to set up programs and discussions around the different episodes. They're all themed on issues that cut across national borders, including many of the ones we talked about: reintegration, incarcerated women, correctional centers that actually correct, and pretrial detention, other kinds of things. And they're all narrated in, that one has my voice narrating. It's our just little preview teaser, but the episodes are all told in the voice of those who have lived prison around the world, from country to country, and really centers their voices.
Okay, Bas, thanks a lot for everything that you have been sharing with us. We will open now the floor for the Q&A session. So we have already a few questions here for you. So I will go ahead with the first one that says, you mentioned that the contact in university with those that have been incarcerated contributes to fight a lot of misconceptions. You also mentioned during this talk studies regarding misconceptions about what we believe justice is. Can you go explain in more detail how we could break these misconceptions?
Good question. In a one-word answer: education and exposure. I think that until people are able to, sort of the idea that we keep prisons behind walls, right? That it's hidden away, that we don't see what happens there. We don't know what they do there unless you've been in there or have family members, or friends who've been in there. It's a mystery. So part of it is opacity. We need to expose what does happen in there. And so we do that through, that's what a film series, what my book, through these narratives and narratives that share what prison actually does, how it doesn't do what we think it does, how it damages, how it doesn't build safer communities. I think there's also, in the US, there's an organization, Prison Policy, and they put out wonderful statistics. A lot of times data isn't accessible to the average person. So how can we show people that, hey, when people come home from prison, they're actually more likely to go back to prison than before, which is not going to make you in the community any safer. So it's really about creative avenues of spreading the message, of spreading the data, and also elevating the voices of those directly impacted, which is what we do with our series and with all of our events. And I think the fact of using many avenues, you introduced me with all of my many strange combination of hats, and that to me is what makes INN, for instance, do what we do. We want to reach lots of audiences. We don't want to just preach to the choir. We want to reach, average people in the community. We want to reach influencers and filmmakers and artists and really get this message out to a broad variety of contexts so that the narrative shifts in a big way.
Okay, so next question. Recidivism rates are not the only way of measuring the success of prison systems. Do you have any suggestion of other measurement criteria?
I think we need to recognize, I think we need to measure sort of success rates beyond recidivism. Someone can come home from prison and remain homeless for the rest of his or her life and not go back to prison, and that's considered a success. So I actually think that if we really measured according to, different criteria of attainment of goals or, levels of stability and mental, emotional health, then our, and when I say our, I mean really the global recidivism rates would look even worse than they already look. And so it's not, not going back to prison is a very, very low bar. I think we need to think about, other goals of how one wants to live and whether one has achieved goals and built, family, et cetera, and things like that. And mental health as well, because really at what cost? Even if everyone who went to prison didn't go back to prison again, but came home with lasting trauma, and went about life carrying that lasting trauma, they may not go back to prison carrying that trauma, but they're impacting generations. They're impacting their families, their friends, their communities in all kinds of ways that comes back to damage us all. And so we have to think bigger than simply recidivism.
So you have visited prisons and places of detention throughout the world. You actually say that incarceration as the only solution of punishment is a global problem. Why is incarceration failing, and what would you say are the main problems of traditional prisons?
So, gosh, I could talk about that for several hours, but the thing is that in a very basic way, the idea that you would take someone who has probably already come from a scenario of lack of privilege and lack of access to jobs, opportunities, perhaps mental health care, perhaps substance abuse issues, and who has caused harm as a result of those things, and then put that person lock them away in basically a dungeon that is rife with those things and produces even more trauma, even more shame, even more pain for this person. and exposes them to others who are similarly experiencing it in this way and coming up with all kinds of mechanisms for dealing with it that are not healthy because the healthy ones don't exist there. And then you send this person back to the community after a year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. And then you imagine that that person is going to just miraculously be better and be a model citizen after all of that. I mean, just without any statistics or data, it doesn't make much sense at all. It just goes against all common sense. And that not only that, I mean, and I didn't even get into that when we send that person back into society, they're discriminated against legally and socially. They can't get into certain housing opportunities. They can't get jobs. No one wants to hire them. I mean, you are really creating an avenue for lack of safety with that system alone. And so there's no way that any system grounded as such is going to produce, law-abiding, happy citizens who are contributing to our societies. And those who do come home from prison and that type of context and defy the odds are defying the odds. They're not, the norm. And so we need to sort of step back and look at the very basic concept of prison. And I think when we talk about, abolition as a movement, the idea of a world without prisons, there are many dimensions to what that means. It means creating a society where certain peoples, certain others are not being funneled into the system to begin with. It means social services. It means avenues to opportunity that don't land people in prison to begin with. It means that when people do cause harm, there are all kinds of approaches to it, grounded in restorative efforts. And other kinds of, healing centers and opportunity for people to receive the healing that they deserve and own responsibility for their actions and make reparations for what they, this is what they deserve. And so overall, that's the world that I'm looking towards and working towards that makes a whole lot more sense than, medieval dungeons. I talk about in my book, I get into the history of prisons, and it's an old idea. It's an archaic idea that has had its time, ultimately.
So next question, could you share with us how do you see the position of imprisoned women, including when they are moms with their kids in prison?
So again, another topic that we can talk for another hour about, but women are the fastest rising prison population globally in the US. The rates have skyrocketed by something like 700% in the last 10 years. One of our Incarceration Nations episodes focuses on the plight of women and how that plight looks very similar again around the world, in that women are often victims of the war on drugs, the global war on drugs, in ways that transcend that of men. They're often the small foot soldiers in the war on drugs, and so they're sort of easy to net. They are also, again, globally speaking, often incarcerated for a crime that involved a man or a partner. And so husband, boyfriend and such, so that gender roles and inequality of gender roles plays its part in fueling the incarceration of women. And they are also overwhelmingly, you mentioned this artificial binary of victim and offender. That applies to all people in prison, but particularly to women who are victims of domestic violence, who have, survivors of all kinds of abuse. The data isn't available in all countries, but in the US, we know that upwards of 80% of women in prison have experienced abuse. And so the response to that, again, common sense, to respond to somebody's trauma with further trauma is not benefiting anyone involved, including society at large.
Okay, I think we have the $1 million question here now. So at INN website, it says prisons are a failure of imagination. So if you were in charge, how would you redesign the system?
Yeah, that is, I know that's always what I get asked. So how do you fix it? What's the answer? Look, there is no one answer. And certainly, I would never have a single answer that I would cut and paste on the world, because that's what got us in this mess in the first place, which is the American style system, modeled after European ideas, being cut and pasted on the world. So you find a prison modeled after an American prison in Chile or in Rwanda. But that said, I mean, much of what I was talking about before in terms of abolition, to me, is the answer, which means profound investment in things that don't send people to prison in the first place, or that keep people from going to prison in the first place. Jobs, education, housing, legislating against inequalities. We also need to look at our laws and particularly our misdemeanors, or what in some countries in the global South are called petty offenses, including drugs. I support the legalization of drugs, and I support harm reduction approaches and not a war on drugs. We also need to rethink how we approach violence and ground our approach to violence in a restorative justice one, as opposed to one that is a system of harm, a cycle of harm, in which a traumatized person who's committed violence is further damaged and then commits further harm, and the cycle perpetuates. And I am a fan of creative places of healing. I don't use the word prison, because I think it's thinking about what could be a prison that is so unlike prison as to be worthy of another name altogether, where people who have committed harm and do need to be taken away for a time to work on themselves, to make amends for what they have done, to create an avenue for justice. I think often about the fact that initially prisons were not the answer. They were not justice. They were the holding cells while a system of justice was determined. And I think about going back to something like that, which is grounded again in a restorative approach, and recognizes that we should stop using this archaic Enlightenment, pseudo-mathematical idea of 5 years in a warehouse equals justice. And how do we move past that? But I also always look towards our partners all over the world and their innovations, and say, you've got the answers. How can we support, and how can we build together as we radically innovate?
So last question for you, Baz. You mentioned that laws are targeting certain citizens, such as African Americans, Roma people, etc. In order to control the population, could you please provide us with some examples of how this is happening? How are these citizens being incarcerated at much higher rates than other citizens?
So there isn't always data available, again, depending on the population. But I mean, on our website, again, we have a whole section on who is targeted that gets into some of the more specifics in terms of data. And I think in the US, this has been thoroughly documented in terms of, see the movie 13th, for example, which tracks exactly how African Americans were criminalized post-slavery in order to produce mass incarceration, or read the book, The New Jim Crow. In other countries, it's there is less data, but it's more about understanding, say, how colonialism worked in a place, throughout countries in Africa, for example. So in Kenya, when you look at the laws and the history of the petty offenses, they were created under the colonial regime in order to target specific people. Criminalizing loitering or loud music, for instance, is a way that the police can enforce them at will against certain people. And we know that that historically has happened and continues to happen, because if you have the money for a lawyer to get you out, should you happen to be targeted for loitering in Kenya, which is still a crime on the books to this day, and as are others, then if you have the money to get out, you can. If you don't, you don't. And that is deliberate. That is not an accident. And so it plays out similarly in various parts of the world. The Aboriginal Act in Australia, or a series of acts, operated as apartheid did, operated as the Black Codes in the US did. There is lots of history on this stuff, and it's critical to know it.
Okay, Bas, thank you so much. We'll have to close the session here. So I want to finish also with something that you put in your book, and this was that changed policy is a product of changed public consciousness. So I do hope that this conversation we had has brought some reflection, some new ideas to the Portuguese population on how relevant it is for all of us as a developed society to really take care of our incarcerated people. So thanks a lot for joining us today, Bas. Thanks to APAC Portugal and Instituto Miguel Galvão Teles, who made this event possible. And also thank you to our partners, Delta, Rescaled Movement, Active Citizens Fund, Reshape Ceramics, and ECHO. So next week, we will be back on May 6th with João Aires Pereira and Matt Dwyer on how can space trigger reintegration at noon. So thank you, everyone, and thank you especially to you, Bas.
Thank you.